When a Coca-Cola can labeled Made in Canada appears on a Walmart shelf in Detroit, it is no longer a glitch in the supply chain, but a warning signal for an entire industry quietly retreating from the United States. In less than 2 years, billions of dollars in manufacturing capital and tens of thousands of jobs have silently crossed the northern border, taking with them battery lines, truck frames, and once proud Made in USA symbols. And the root cause does not lie in the market, but in policy. Steel and aluminum tariffs, along with administrative procedures, have pushed American corporations off home soil. This is no longer a debate about protectionism. It is a survival equation for the future of American industry. The price of a signature. There were no alarm bells, no crowds of protesters, no emotional farewell speeches echoing from the factories of Michigan or Ohio. Only quietly closed doors, halted assembly lines, and temporary layoff notices pinned to walls, like a silent reminder that a single signature from the White House can begin the unraveling of America's long-standing manufacturing structure. When President Donald Trump signed the order to raise steel and aluminum tariffs to 50%, no one thought a policy labeled as national security protection could drive America's own industrial fortresses to be the first to flee. But the story isn't about the percentage of the tariff, it's about the chain reaction it triggered. In the world of global manufacturing, where every cent in cost determines survival, one stroke of a pen can be the bell that starts a large-scale exodus. And this time, the destination isn't China or Mexico, but Canada. Less than 3 weeks after the new tariff took effect, General Motors and Ford, two names once tied to the term American Dream, quietly pulled frame orders out of Michigan and redirected them to plants in Oakville and Ingersoll, Ontario. No grand announcements, no long debates, just balance sheets, where the numbers said it all. Importing a ton of aluminum now costs 27% more, adding nearly $4,900 to every Silverado. A figure enough to swallow GM's entire annual profit margin. In a market where consumer spending has already maxed out, manufacturers can't simply tack on a few $1,000s to the price without losing customers. They have only one way out: move production lines to a place not penalized by their own country's tax policies. And that place, ironically, is their closest ally, Canada. In Quebec, where Hydro-Quebec sells industrial electricity for just 5.7 cents per kilowatt-hour, nearly half the rate in Detroit, American corporations suddenly find themselves entering a parallel version of the United States. Not just cheap, clean electricity, but an investment environment that is open, less constrained, and far less bureaucratic. A battery plant consuming power at the scale of a gigafactory could save tens of millions of dollars annually on electricity alone, not to mention being exempt from carbon taxes when exporting to Europe. On the other side, what Americans are holding on to, a tariff shield supposedly protecting the domestic metal industry, is turning into a double-edged sword, cutting off supply chains at home. Alcoa, instead of expanding its Tennessee facility, chose to delay maintenance and boost capacity in Quebec. Tesla, rather than rolling out its battery recycling project in Nevada, quietly broke ground in Valleyfield, where a clean energy network and billions in CAD incentives await. But the consequences don't stop with strategic decisions by corporate executives. They seep into individuals and families. 25,000 jobs in Ohio, Michigan, and Georgia, once industrial heartlands, now stand on the brink of disappearance. Engineers and machinists who once believed Made in USA was a promise to the future now face the bitter truth. The cars they used to assemble, the cans they used to seal, may soon be made across the border. The bitterest part? This is not an unorganized exodus. It is a calculated migration, shaped by months of cost analysis, risk assessment, permit delays, energy prices, and climate policy. When the new manufacturing location is cheaper, cleaner, and faster, no appeal to patriotism or civic duty can compete with the logic of profitability. And while headlines in Washington still revolve around protecting American industry, container by container of machinery is being loaded, crossing the Ambassador Bridge and stamped with a new line, "Assembled in Canada." No fanfare, no tears, just a cold, weighty retreat by the very industrial symbols that once defined the American dream. Because sometimes what collapses an empire isn't a war, but an economic miscalculation repeated for too long with no one willing to fix it. The new border of energy and procedure. It's not steel nor cheap labor, but rather electricity prices and permitting times that are redrawing the industrial map of North America. In an era where speed is money, where every hour of delay can ruin an entire supply chain, Canada, once seen as a secondary market, is suddenly becoming the new launch pad for production, not through noise, but with a series of brutally practical policies. Cheap, clean power, and astonishingly short permitting timelines. As multinational corporations begin comparing costs on both sides of the border, the differences become as clear as daylight. In Quebec, the average industrial electricity price is just 3.68 cents per kilowatt hour, while at the same time, Michigan, the heart of American industry, is paying over 8.5 cents per kilowatt hour, according to data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, so EIA. For sectors that consume billions of kilowatt hours per year, like battery production, metallurgy, or canning, the electricity bill alone can determine a factory's survival. And that's just the surface. Underneath, Canada is quietly building an investment foundation that no U.S. industrial state can compete with. Fast permitting, policy consistency, and a proactive approach to working with businesses. The Fast Track National Interest Projects Act, passed by Ottawa in early 2025, gives the government the authority to label any battery factory, green steel mill, or strategic mineral site like nickel, graphite, and cobalt as a project of national importance. Once labeled, all administrative procedures must be completed within 90 days. No delays, no back and forth between agencies. Everything is processed through a single window system, and cabinet ministers themselves handle the files. In contrast is the grim picture in the U.S., where the average permitting time for large industrial projects ranges from 18 to 24 months, and sometimes even longer if facing public opposition or environmental reviews under California's CEQA Act. Not every company can afford to wait 2 years while the market shifts every quarter. Campbell's Soup is a prime example. After 2 years stuck in the process of renewing a wastewater permit in Ohio, the company abruptly pivoted, signing a land lease in Kingston, Ontario in less than 3 months to build a fully automated cold storage facility, the first step toward moving its entire canning line to Canada. The irony is that Campbell didn't lack investment capital in the U.S. They only lacked time and certainty. Tesla quietly followed a similar path. In Markham, Ontario, the Tesla Automation Center doubled in size to manufacture equipment for 4,680 batteries. Not because labor is cheaper, but because Ontario committed to completing all paperwork in under 3 months. Meanwhile, in Nevada, the same project was delayed due to an unresolved groundwater extraction permit, despite the application having been submitted since 2023. For companies, it's not just about electricity prices or tax incentives. It's about the ability to predict the future and plan capital expenditures. When Canada says 90 days, they mean 90 days. When the U.S. says protect manufacturing, the tariff rates might shift the very next day, leaving investors without a firm foothold. Ottawa understands this, And they don't just use policy to attract capital. They foster long-term trust. Commitments on stable electricity pricing until 2040. Pre-secured clean energy purchase agreements at gigawatt scale for Alcoa and Tesla. Support packages for local workforce training, equipment tax rebates, and above all, a government willing to act as a business partner, not a bureaucratic hurdle. That's what is changing the logic of the entire industrial sector. Today, an American business no longer just asks, where is cheaper, but rather, where is more certain, where gets things done faster, where actually listens. Canada, in this invisible competition, didn't win through gimmicks. They won through consistency, transparency, and a forward-thinking mindset. And when factories from Coca-Cola to Ford, from Tesla to Campbell Soup, line up at the gates of Ontario and Quebec, the real concern for Washington policymakers shouldn't be, how do we get them to stay? But why are we steadily losing the trust of those who once bet on the American industrial dream? The reversed flow of jobs and capital. If, in the golden years of globalization, manufacturing capital once poured into the United States like a magnet drawing in steel, then now those very steel beams are lifting off American soil, quietly drifting north. And following them are jobs, skills, and the hopes of tens of thousands of working-class families, people who once saw the factory as a life anchor and industrial wages as a ticket out of lower-class uncertainty. In just 18 months, the U.S. has witnessed a loss of over $7.2 billion in manufacturing capital. A number that might seem abstract, but if converted, it's enough to build 4 Tesla-style giga-battery plants, each generating thousands of high-quality jobs and spawning tens of thousands of auxiliary positions in logistics, materials, equipment, and technical services. The question is, where did that money go? The answer is Ontario, Quebec, and Central Canada, regions now rising as the new California, not through consumer tech, but through industrial infrastructure. Batteries, green steel, canning, nickel, cathode materials, graphite separation, and clean energy. General Motors, after calculating material costs, electricity rates, and tariffs, pulled back a planned $2.6 billion U.S. investment and redirected it to 2 northern coordinates, St. Catharines, Ontario, and Bécancour, Quebec. There, not only was a battery plant established, but also an electric drive unit assembly center with a 400,000 unit per year capacity, preserving over 500 skilled jobs in Canada, while 1,300 workers in Michigan were put on rotating furlough. Similarly, Alcoa, the metallurgy icon of America, lost its patience with energy bills in Indiana and Pennsylvania. The increase in aluminum tariffs from 25% to 50% alone, as reported in its Q1 2025 financials, cost the company nearly $90 million in profit, equivalent to 65% of its aluminum segment EBITDA. Rather than rescue old plants, Alcoa funneled capital into Quebec, where it just extended a 2.1 gigawatt hydroelectric contract through 2040, securing stable feedstock and avoiding carbon border taxes when exporting to Europe. Campbell Soup, the name synonymous with red and white American soup cans, hasn't escaped this wave either. CFO Carrie Anderson openly admitted just steel tariffs alone ate up $0.05 per share in quarterly earnings and multiplied by over 300 million shares. That's a $15 million quarterly loss. So they repackaged their strategy, shifted can production to Canada, signed a new contract with a plant outside Toronto, and brought along label printers, carton factories, and paper packaging suppliers. Few noticed, but that single decision dragged at least 4 suppliers, 2 printers, and 1 packaging factory out of the U.S., changing the entire manufacturing landscape of the Midwest. Behind every cross-border container lies more than goods. It carries jobs, tax revenue, and trust in the investment climate. Ports in Duluth and Toledo, once bustling with rolled aluminum and steel cans, are now seeing container traffic down by over 20% year over year, according to the Great Lakes Port Authority. The result? Dock workers have shifted to a 3 days on, 4 days off schedule, not due to lack of labor, but lack of cargo to handle. Even the transport sector feels the sting. When Campbell reduced rolled steel orders from Ohio, flatbed trucking companies from Gary to Camden lost contracts. Drivers waited idly. Repair garages sat empty. And wheat farms supplying the soup plant reported declining orders. Capital withdrawal never travels alone. It pulls with it entire supply chains, supporting industries, and towns whose ecosystems revolve around a single factory. And the bitterest truth, none of this is happening because of a lack of capability, but because of misaligned policies. When companies no longer believe they can forecast production costs, when they lose confidence in tariff stability, and when every new project must wait 2 years just for approval, then, no matter how patriotic they must do what economic logic demands: leave. And, like a reversed current, Canada, slow and silent, has rolled out the path, laid down the red carpet, and opened the gates to this capital flow. Not through slogans, not through propaganda, but through cheaper electricity, faster permitting, and more trustworthy long-term commitments. If the U.S. keeps hesitating, it won't just lose a few factories. It will lose its central role in the 21st century supply chain. And by the time it realizes, the made-in-USA electric vehicle may already carry batteries from Quebec, frames from Ontario, and the determination of another government. The advantage map is changing color. In strategic meetings at American industrial corporations, an Excel spreadsheet now carries more weight than any political slogan. It's no longer about geographic maps, but cost maps, where every electricity row, every energy column, every note on permitting times or carbon taxes quietly redraws the position of industrial strength. And if anyone still thinks Made in USA is the default, those lines of numbers are painting a cold conclusion. The manufacturing advantage has shifted. And it's no longer south of the 49th parallel. The heart of this shift isn't just about tariffs. It's the dangerous combination of high energy costs, administrative delays, and the unpredictable swings of trade policy. From Coca-Cola cans to Silverado frames, from Tesla batteries to Campbell's soup, all are facing a new reality. The United States is no longer the most efficient place to manufacture, even for Americans themselves. Look at energy costs, once the core advantage of America in the 20th century. But today, as the world enters the age of clean electricity and carbon-neutral products, that edge has reversed. While Hydro-Quebec guarantees long-term hydroelectric prices at just 3.68 cents per kilowatt-hour, factories in industrial states like Michigan, Indiana, or Kentucky pay 8 to 11 cents per kilowatt-hour on average, especially as they still rely on gas and coal-fired grids. That gap, seemingly just a few cents, becomes a double-edged sword when scaled up to the billions of kilowatt-hours that factories like Tesla, Alcoa, or Coca-Cola consume each year. It eats away at profit margins and disqualifies American products from markets with strict emission standards like Europe or California, where green steel certification, zero-emission batteries, and carbon-neutral supply chains are required. That's why, as Europe implements the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, and California adopts carbon indexing for EV components, companies are re-examining the map and no longer see the U.S. as a safe destination. Not just because energy is expensive, but because that energy isn't clean, and the legal system doesn't help them prove otherwise. Canada, by contrast, not only offers cheap and clean electricity, but the ability to prove it quickly. Long-term power purchase agreements with Hydro-Québec aren't just financial commitments, they're passports into premium export markets. When Tesla pledges to manufacture electrodes in Valleyfield using 100% clean electricity, it not only slashes operating costs, but also clears the EU's carbon tax barriers without paying a single euro more. The advantage doesn't just come from infrastructure, it comes from trust. Trust that costs won't spike overnight due to policy shifts. Trust that the government understands industrial urgency and acts as a partner, not a barrier. And trust that when a company invests billions in a plant, it won't be shackled by a multi-year permitting process just to obtain a wastewater license. At this point, CFOs are no longer asking, where can we save the most money on a factory? But where can we stay globally competitive for the next 20 years? And to that question, more and more answers now carry two cold words. Canada already, when the assembly line no longer recognizes borders. No one imposes tariffs on an assembly line, but misguided tax policies can make that entire line disappear. And that's exactly what's happening. Not in the future, but right now. When a Coca-Cola can is embossed in Toronto, a Silverado frame welded in Ingersoll, or an LFP battery cell cooked in a furnace in Valleyfield, then what's called American manufacturing no longer belongs to America in the traditional sense. The entire production line is shifting, and it's not looking back. These shifts are neither scattered nor temporary. They're interlinked, following a closed-loop logic with a level of systemic precision that's almost coldly elegant. The Tesla factory in Ontario doesn't just make batteries. It's surrounded by facilities processing graphite, nickel, electrolytes, and recycling centers. GM doesn't just assemble electric motors in Niagara, it's partnering with POSCO to build a cathode plant next to a deep-water port. Campbell Soup isn't just moving its canning line, it's dragging the entire supply chain of packaging, printing, and logistics with it. These aren't short waves. This is structural migration, programmed based on electricity costs, carbon tax policies, permitting speed, and long-term incentives. A new industrial ecosystem is forming across the border, and it's becoming harder and harder to reverse. Every time a major company sets foot in Ontario or Quebec, it doesn't come alone. It brings a chain of Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers. One battery plant brings with it ore processing sites, steel rolling mills, transportation hubs, container yards, cold storage facilities, and a full logistics network from seaports to highways. Each new link, each auxiliary facility, is a nail fastening the assembly line into Canadian soil. An example? Campbell only had to move its soup can production from the US to Canada. And label printers, carton factories, lid manufacturers, all followed. Nothing keeps them in the US if the supply chain is no longer large enough to ensure minimum order volume. Once a steel rolling plant in Ohio loses orders from 3 to 4 major clients, it has to cut capacity, prices go up, and remaining customers leave too, unable to bear the cost. The domino effect needs no push. It falls on its own, by the law of survival. Worse still, once an entire industry cluster leaves the US, it's not just production that vanishes, but knowledge, craftsmanship, and training systems too. A metallurgical engineer in Montreal doesn't just roll steel. He trains the next generation. A battery maintenance technician in Valleyfield doesn't just keep machines running. He helps improve processes, build technical manuals, and becomes part of the collective memory of the industry. America isn't just losing products, it's losing expertise. And that also means, even if later policy changes, tariffs drop, or the White House launches new incentive packages, companies might not return, because where they are now, north of the border, has become a safe harbor, complete and with long-term prospects. No one abandons a fully operational, smoothly running supply chain just to return to a place with higher costs, slower bureaucracy, and an uncertain future. In other words, once the assembly line has crossed the border, no border can bring it back. The next wave won't stop at cars and aluminum cans. If anyone still thinks the current exodus is just about the auto industry, soft drinks, or canned food, then they've underestimated the scale and speed of this shift. The truth is, when the industrial foundation of a nation begins to crack, it doesn't choose its victims. It spreads horizontally, fractures vertically, and pulls down even those sectors once thought untouchable. Semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, aerospace, even national defense. Because a supply chain doesn't rely on raw materials alone. It also needs stable energy, reasonable costs, rapid infrastructure deployment, and clear environmental policies. When those factors are no longer guaranteed in the U.S., even the industries requiring the highest levels of precision and security, once considered national strongholds, begin to wobble. Take pharmaceuticals, for instance. An antibiotic plant doesn't need steel frames like a Silverado or can bodies like Coca-Cola, but it consumes massive electricity for filtering, testing, refrigeration, and sterilization. And most of that electricity must run 24/7. A power outage lasting just a few minutes can ruin an entire batch of medicine worth millions of dollars. That's why, when Canada not only guarantees cheap electricity, but also clean and stable power, pharmaceutical manufacturers begin recalculating. Similarly, the semiconductor industry, which the U.S. is pouring tens of billions of dollars into to bring home, is facing a bitter paradox. Electricity and water costs in chip-producing states are nearly double those in Ontario. That price gap alone has forced many projects to rethink their approach, especially as Canada rolls out rapid incentives for high-tech clusters, along with fast-tracked permits and strong commitments to train local engineers. But the biggest concern is national defense. Few people notice that every bolt, every aircraft frame, every steel plate for submarines or armored vehicles is affected by steel and aluminum tariffs. When those tariffs hit 50%, the cost of defense components rises, and the Pentagon's budget isn't infinitely elastic. That forces many defense contractors to look for new suppliers, and they aren't shy about looking north. From there, a stark irony emerges. The U.S. erects tariff walls to protect its strategic metals industry, but the result is that many defense production lines are now sourcing components from Canada, where there are no tariffs, no permitting delays, and it's still a close ally. A contractor in Pennsylvania had to shift orders for ultra-high-strength steel bolts to Ontario simply because post-tariff prices in the U.S. were 27% higher, and delivery times were delayed by up to 3 months due to material shortages. This is no longer a matter of simple costs. This is a supply chain security equation in a world where geopolitics grows more tangled by the day. When the U.S. pushes itself out of the role of the last trusted manufacturer, allies, from the EU to Japan, begin adjusting their orders, diversifying risk, and turning to more stable production hubs like Canada. An industrial wave never stops at one shore. It sweeps through every layer of the value chain, from low-end to high-end, from common to strategic. And if that expansion isn't recognized in time, the U.S. risks losing far more than what's already visible in the headlines. It risks losing its central role in the global production system of the 21st century. When the final choice is reform or retreat from the race, there is no longer much time to debate the definition of patriotism in economics. if production lines have already quietly left American soil? There is no more room for political hesitation when every electric vehicle rolling down Michigan Avenue carries a battery assembled in Quebec and a frame welded in Ontario. The issue now is no longer how to keep businesses from leaving, but whether the United States dares to change before its entire industrial order is completely replaced. The numbers don't lie. While the White House continues to tighten tariffs in the name of protectionism, investment capital is flowing north at the speed of an organized retreat. A total of more than 52.5 billion Canadian dollars has been committed by Ottawa and the provinces into the battery supply chain, green steel, and strategic materials. Not because they are too rich, but because they understand. If they don't act now, they will miss the one chance to step into the position that the U.S. is inadvertently vacating. Meanwhile, Washington remains tied down by its own policies. High energy costs, project permitting that takes years, and tariffs that change like the weather have forced even the most loyal corporations to admit they cannot keep producing with negative profit margins and uncontrollable risk. Every protective barrier built with good intentions, when lacking viable alternatives, becomes a wall that isolates the country from the future. And it is in that very moment that America stands before two clear choices. One is to keep raising tariff walls, delay reform, and watch production lines continue to move across the border. The other is to bravely face the truth, reform its energy foundation, administrative infrastructure, and policy mindset to create an investment environment that no business wants to leave. The second option is not easy. It requires political consensus, long-term investment in clean energy, and a full institutional overhaul of how permitting, approval, and industrial support are handled. But if it does not happen, the U.S. will not only lose factories, it will lose the ability to shape the industrial order of the 21st century. Because today's supply chains do not wait. They go where things are faster, cheaper, cleaner, and more stable. And if Canada can offer all four within less than 2 years, then there's no reason the next sectors, from synthetic biology, artificial intelligence, to semiconductors and defense, won't also consider relocating out of the United States. When a shopper at Walmart buys a can of soda labeled "Produced in Canada," they may not realize what's changing. But when that same can causes a plant in Ohio to cut 280 shifts, then the migration is no longer a corporate matter. It becomes the problem of an entire nation. The final question is no longer who's right, who's wrong in this tariff war. It is, will the United States dare to correct its course before it's too late? Will Washington dare to remove the tariff shield and replace it with a sustainable, fair, and effective infrastructure strategy? Because if not, every imported product, from frames, aluminum cans, to EV batteries, will not only carry a Made in Canada label, but also an unspoken indictment of a superpower that refused to change.